Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Mary Lauder, and you are listening to the Since You Put It That Way podcast. It's the show that examines various health, wellness, and medical topics from unique perspectives. We will be having discussions and guests that will cause you to pause and consider, well, since you put it that way. Greetings, all you health and wellness wayfinders. Welcome to another episode of Since You Put It That Way, the podcast that I host. And today we have our special guest again, Carol Ritberger, Dr. Ritberger. And she's co-hosting with me again for Cosmic Health and Wellness. Our topic today is looking at personalities and trauma, or understanding how the trauma response affects personalities. So we're putting our heads together and we're having a great conversation. That's a lot of fun and very informative. So I hope you enjoy. Buckle up because it's pretty cosmic. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are back. Carol Ritberger and myself, Mary Lauder, the Paradox, the dynamic duo in Cosmic Health and Wellness, another one of our podcasts where we're looking at all things from health and wellness that literally could be out of this world, but actually is everyday stuff. So welcome, Carol. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you. Yes, isn't that the truth? It is everyday stuff.
It really is. I mean, this is, in our last...
This is the mystery of the woo-woo right here in this whole thing. Every day is mystery of the woo-woo.
Exactly. And in our last episode, we were talking about how really we are energy, everything's energy, and yet it's classified as the alternative medicine. And I said, I'm not sure that I want something that's not what I am, and so I think I'll just stick with the reality of that we are all energy. So we're going to stick there for sure. So our topic today, I'd like to delve into some ideas regarding personalities, the work that you've done around personalities. And that's been really epic and very, change-worthy and helpful for folks to really integrate and bring that into their lives. And then take that concept of the personalities and how we mix that when people have significant trauma in their life. And I've got questions around trauma, like, is it ubiquitous? Is that because we hear about it all the time now? How are we more traumatized than we've been, or are we recognizing it? So I've got lots of questions around that relative to our personalities, personality development, because we put that in the category diagnostically as a personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
We tag something to it. We have, codependency. We have borderline personalities. We have, different, even sub areas of psychoses that occurs because of trauma, because people have to literally remove themselves so they can be safe. And so they do that psychically, emotionally, psychologically. And so I just have lots of questions around that. And it's just an area of curiosity and passion for me, because I think it's an important part that contributes to a person's healing overall.
Absolutely. And a major contributor to the types of chronic pain they have, the type of disease they develop.
Yes.
How that chemistry trauma shows up in the DNA and triggers a lot of the genetic qualities about it. So it is something that, is much more, it's more far reaching than just what happens to us psychologically.
Yeah. So is trauma everywhere, or are we just really finally acknowledging the fact that it's everywhere?
I believe that it's the fact that, like everything, that we've reached a place in the evolution of who we are is recognizing the underlying currents of what creates a lot of the patterns of behavior that we experience and how it doesn't feel like it's in alignment with us. So there's always been trauma. And, we can go back, trauma when a saber-toothed tiger got you, or things like that. So there's always been trauma. I think that the the part of it is now where it is we're talking about it. And that's an important part of the process of learning to understand it, kind of that mystery we talked about in the last episode, understanding the mystery or the elements underlying it. And I think that the more we talk about it, the more we're going to take the emotions out of the trauma. We're not going to forget the trauma, but the emotions that make us feel bad about who we are, or make us hide from who we are, or make us don't feel safe or afraid, whatever it is. So I think that this is a very important step. There's always a risk, as you and I have talked before, Mary, with something when it starts to come forward and it starts to get talked about, is that there's a naturalness in our human nature to have to categorize and label.
Mhm.
And I understand the importance of that from the standpoint of it helps us recognize what it is and the psychosis of it.
Mhm.
But it also becomes a label that imprints so much psychologically that it actually feeds the trauma and tells the brain to accept it even more, because now this is who you are, this is what it is. And then what it does is the brain goes in and the psyche goes in and protects that trauma.
Mhm.
It sees it as the norm. And so I think talking about it is a value, but I think we've reached a place, personal opinion, I think we've reached the place where even the psychological and psychiatric approach to the healing from a psychological perspective is talk therapy isn't working.
I agree 100%. 100%. And that has been my experience over 30 years as a physician, that just,
Yeah.
people do not want to open up those wounds, and
No,
then,
because they're physically, they're not just psychologically painful, they are physically painful. They feel it in their gut, and they feel it in their, their body and their muscles and everything. It is a physical trauma as well as
it is.
probably an emotional or psychological trauma.
Right. And of course, Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book on The Body Keeps the Score,
Oh, yes.
or Mate wrote the book on The Body Says No, When the Body Says No, and looking at areas in the body. And the osteopaths talk about the somato-emotional component, meaning the emotions that are held in the body. And all
Yes.
three of these different not paradigms, but viewpoints actually align between the three different ideas of the body keeping the score when the body says no, and the fact that the somato-emotional component is present.
Absolutely.
And I think I think as we learn it, the different physicians and clinicians and therapists, one of those maybe, and there's probably more ways to explain it as well, but say one of these three explanations really allows someone to see what's happening, so then they can translate that for the patient and help the patient.
Absolutely. And you engage in, it's the movement of our desire to become whole, if we want to say it that way, or to be authentic to who we are, we could say it that way, is that when doing trauma work is to approach it from a self-healing perspective.
Yes.
To be able to not necessarily give medication. Sometimes people need it. I'm the first one to do that. If I'm working with someone and they really need to have medication, I'm going to be the very first one, even though I consider it energetic and medical intuitive, I'm going to tell them that that would be the best thing to help them get through it. But the other part of it is I think that we really do need to take what's happening and not use it as an excuse, but use it as an opportunity to really look at the fact that the underlying factors of trauma are really very identifiable and very predictable. For example, is that, a trauma that creates behavior around not enough is going to express itself differently than a trauma around not being loved or lovable versus a trauma of not being strong enough, or the trauma of not being smart enough, however that played out. It could be something very innocuous that happened when we were young. It could be very overt. But I think that if we went and looked at trauma and we started to look at it as a process of fragmenting ourselves from who we are, and the mind protecting that hurt, that trauma that keeps us fragmented from ourselves, then I think that we will approach trauma completely differently.
I think Gabor Mate is the man that changed my thoughts on trauma the most. And he said all trauma causes us to disconnect, to dissociate from ourselves, our true selves. And he said then the behaviors that occur are the things that replace our ability to connect, or if they go far enough, are the behaviors that even then allow us to stay on the planet. And
Exactly.
he went to the area of addiction. And he sat down and talked with folks who were heroin addicts, crack addicts, things like that. I mean, serious, what we would say serious or difficult to maybe help or cure or heal. And as he dealt with the trauma, each time he saw them get closer and closer to their real self, to where they were able to reconnect.
Yes. Well, and if you look at trauma and you look at addiction, and we'll stay with addiction, is that we think that people who have addiction, say to heroin or meth or whatever it is that they do it because they absolutely love doing it. They do it because it gives them that high that they're looking for. And what we're realizing from that neurological, physiological, psychological part of it is they don't like it. They're doing it because it stops the hurt. They don't want to hurt.
Right.
And so the addiction comes from being addicted to not wanting to hurt. And if we could find ways to be able to approach that in a way that would create the space for them to move toward themselves. The shamans call it the soul retrieval, going and finding the fragmented part of self that basically got split, chiseled away, whatever we want, from trauma. And if we looked at it that way, I think we'd have a completely different perception.
Yes. And what I saw when Gabor Mate was talking about this was that addiction was literally the thing that kept the person on the planet.
It is. Absolutely it is.
Yeah. And I have changed how I've shared that with patients. And so it could be a food addiction. It could be, scrolling on our devices. It could be bad relationships, serial bad relationships. It could be a variety of things.
Yep.
And as I saw the healing, and the work that I do with my self-care and connection protocol, what I went away from learning from Gabor Mate was, well, we have to reconnect to heal.
We do.
And when we reconnect or connect, because sometimes we never connected. And when we love, accept, connect, or reconnect, then the body has the maybe the flight path, the landing pattern, the landing area for us to put traumatic events in there by words to present to the nervous system the statements where the traumatic events occurred for the nervous system to then process those.
Yes.
And when we access that and access the thoughts that way, and we get into really what a theta state is, which is a altered state.
Right.
The theta state is that relaxation phase.
Yes, it is.
When that occurs, we can literally change the brain chemistry. We can literally move things out of that midbrain area, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and we can then begin to see those traumatic events turn from the story more into the backstory.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I'll tell you what, that and coming into that and how that has affected people's personalities. For example, I can think of someone who was just so, we would use OCD. obsessive compulsive or just obsessive about lists and categorizing in their daily activities, and must have these things done, and must, checkbox, checkbox, checkbox,
Mhm.
laundry, 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 door, 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 store, store, store. Everything was just so, locked in that way.
Right.
As we begin to unravel the trauma and work with that, she hasn't made a list in months.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. And again, I think that, going back to where we originally started, I think the benefit of this trauma dialogue that we have, and just people openly talking about their trauma, I think that is a step to true healing. And to recognize that it's not about being broken or damaged. It's just about coping. It's just about staying on the planet. It's just about learning. It's interesting, in my world of personality and my research, my approach basically was more Jungian an
Mhm.
approach. That's where a lot of my education is. And Jung believed that there's qualities of the personality called traits that we are born with. They're the neurological hardwiring of who we are. And those traits are specifically around how we gather information, process information, and make decisions. And when I first was introduced to his work, I thought, gosh, this 3.5 pound blob that we have in our skull that basically runs everything. And why does the brain run it one way in the body and the mind tries to run it another way, even though it's a part of the brain and the body's trying to do this and that? I was absolutely enthralled. So what I found is that when we look at personality, the trait part of who we are in the personality is the inherent part. It's hardwired. It is not going to change.
Mhm.
It is the survival mechanism that we use in order to sustain life.
Okay.
It's the 5 physical senses that basically we gravitate maybe more to one of the senses based on our neurology that we're going to look for and we're going to depend on and we're going to trust the most, but that doesn't change.
Mhm.
And then there's the part that's called coping. And
Mhm.
that part of the personality is a reflection of our external stimuli, the opinions, the expectations, the perceptions, the stories that we pick up about ourselves that other people tell us, or how they see us, or who they think we should be. That's really externally involved. And how we literally, it's like, I'll tell personalities all the time, it's like you wake up neurologically this way every single day, you go to bed every single day this way, and then you walk out the front door and now you have to be this, you have to be your coping. And that coping personality isn't who you really are, meaning it's not your true neurology, it's how you get through the day. It's what creates a lot of, most of, if not all of the stress that we experience.
Mhm.
So when you look at trauma and how it affects the personalities, what trauma does first and foremost, I found in my work, is that it takes that inherent hardwiring of our neurology and it makes it more rigid.
Okay.
It's like we have to depend on that part of us because that's who we are. That's so, for example, if you're a personality that makes decisions because they have to feel right and what is called an emotion, not emotional, but an emotion decision maker, and the information that you rely on has to make sense. So now we've got the frontal part of the left hemisphere of the brain, frontal lobe, taking in information, categorizing it, compartmentalizing it, making sense of it, putting in a list. And then neurologically, you have to cross over into the temporal limbic part of the brain into what we call the emotion part of the brain. And you've got to try to make sense emotionally of what's going on. Well, it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And when we have trauma that happens emotionally, what that personality's brain does is it loses its flexibility. It loses, and flexibility means it loses its perception to see things from an expanded perspective. It becomes rigid. If
Okay.
it doesn't make sense, you don't do it. If it doesn't feel right, you don't do it. And when we have trauma, then what happens is that brain and and that neurology of the self-survival part of our traits, that
Yep.
hunkers down and it drives everything. And that can be the underlying behavior of borderline. It can be the underlying behavior of schizophrenia. It can be the underlying behavior of OCD. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Those are just expressions of that fixated, hard, rigid part that is designed to keep us alive.
Okay. So then if we use the concept of triggers, and we
Yes.
and I think also of like the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, which we're now scoring and understanding and looking at that. So if a person has a housing security issue, meaning they've been homeless, they've been abandoned, they've had those types of things, and we would call that a trigger if they suddenly feel, or not suddenly, but if they feel in a situation that their housing or where they live, how they live is going to be disrupted. So walk me through an example like that relative to the rigidity in like a personality area.
Okay. So I'll stay with the personality that we brought up. So in that personality, there's, and each one of the four, I work with four personalities. Each personality has basic needs.
Yep.
And what that personality needs in order to be able to manage this left frontal lobe to that right temporal lobe and that balancing act that takes place is they need stability. They need to have a sense of not control the way we would think of controlling people, but they need to have a sense that they have some semblance of control of their own selves emotionally and their outer world.
Okay.
And so that's a basic need. And when that need gets threatened through trauma, then that trauma becomes one of, you're not going to have that security, you're not going to have that safety because, and I'll use your example, because you haven't had it before. And every time you get close to it, then something happens that creates more trauma, that it gets further away. Now you're abandoned from yourself, you're abandoned from everything else. And the mind changes the way that doesn't change the hardwiring, but changes the coping. It changes the way the five physical senses look for things. So in a case of trauma around fear of abandonment, that mind is reading every situation, every interaction, every conversation, every relationship is, are you going to feed my fear of abandonment?
Or are you just going to leave me? Yeah.
Or are you just going to leave me?
Yeah.
And then what happens is then we become so afraid of that it becomes what we say a self-fulfilling prophecy. We actually attract, here's where energy comes in, here's where personality comes in. We actually attract the very experiences and relationships that feed the fear or the trauma, because that's what the brain chemically now has accepted. The rigidity of the neurology is so set in stone. There's no flexibility. There's no way to see out of it. And it just continues over and over and over. And the body is exquisite, especially when we're young, when most trauma that sets the patterns of behavior and the coping start between birth and 13. And in that period of time, we're so emotionally vulnerable. It's like we have certain foundations within us, but not that. Then that coping part of us, then we start not fitting in. If we don't fit in, then of course we're going to feel abandoned. Everybody's going to abandon us because we don't fit in. And it just becomes a loop. And it becomes a neurological, psychological, physiological loop that the body accepts because the mind said, you need to protect this body, this mind, me from this. The other part of it is that coping part, those are the characteristics, again, the learned behavior. That's the part that's really important if we're going to do trauma work from my perspective with personality. It's to go in and look at the patterns of how we cope in life. If our coping for the particular personality that I was talking about, if the coping of that personality is to avoid, and that's not a judgment, but is to avoid, then they are not going to be willing to open themselves up to be vulnerable to deal with the trauma. So then we have to go in and say, okay, well, look at the behavior. What is the behavior in that coping? What is the behavior that trauma is expressing itself in? It could be neck pain. It could be jaw pain. It could be back pain. It could be digestive issues. Now we can start going in and saying, okay, this is where this is locked in. This is where this neurology and the rigidity and these emotions and the chemistry changes are happening. And this is what we look at. So in the metaphor, the soul speaks in metaphor. So the metaphor of fear of abandonment is not the fear of abandonment. It's the fear that something deep inside of you is eating at you because you are broken. And that particular metaphor of fear of abandonment shows up in the digestive system. There's something deep inside that's eating, it's bothering them, it's creating an inner irritation, it's causing them to almost feed on themselves and their reserves. Does that make sense?
It does. And then the question I've got about that is because we've got digestion, but we aren't going to look at digestion just as a separate set of physiological
Yes.
objectives. Digestion includes just not the idea of taking the bolus of food in and chewing it, getting enzymes attached across the small intestine, through the large intestine and out. But we've got that concept of the microbiome there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interfacing with, which this is super curious to me because the microbiome has its own DNA.
It does.
And it's not us, but it's in us.
Yep.
It's a part of us, but not us. But we've got this interface there that's really is key for the digestion. And I'm literally just thinking about this now going, but wait, what about this? Because because we do have these lots of manuals that say, if your stomach's upset, it's what's eating you. If your skin's if your skin has outbreaks, what's irritating you. And I have come to think that some of those feel trite to me over time now, because our advanced knowledge of the microbiome, of the psychoneuroimmunology, that's a really big word to say, the mind-body connection, and proving how that is. So we've got to pause here for a minute. Tell me what you think about, and if I'm pushing you a little much, it's because I want to, about the microbiome and how that interfaces with digestion and our emotions, because that's a thing.
Well, the microbiome is the pureness of who we are. We could hypothetically woo-woo. I'm going to take you woo-woo.
Okay.
That the microbiome is, we could say, a hologram of the soul. It's that interface. It's that part of us.
I never thought of it that way. Never. I always
wondered. It's kind of like the immune system is for the physical body. It's like the soul, the microbiome is that pure part of who we are. It's that whole part of who we are. It's the healer part of who we are. It isn't the part that becomes wounded or jaded. Yes, it can become maybe chemically influenced. I'm not even going to use altered.
It becomes imbalanced.
So it does.
So, I mean, we've got, sometimes within the microbiome, we've got bacteria that doesn't belong.
Correct.
Parasites that don't belong, or it, okay, maybe they do belong. I don't know. I mean, um,
Well,
hey, I'm
well,
just
and
having a
again, this
moment
is,
here.
yeah, well,
Usually it would be like
this is why this cosmic part of it, and cosmic
Yes.
meaning, let's look beyond.
Yes.
So if we were to go in and say that, let's see how I can do this. The soul sees everything in metaphor. So let's do this together.
Yep.
So what would the metaphor of a parasite be? Let's do this because this is an important part of how we can expand looking at trauma.
Yeah. Parasite would be something that I see it as coming in and going along for the ride.
Absolutely. And
Um,
that's coping. That's trauma.
okay. So if there's parasites, there's trauma, is what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly. So if we went in and we said, okay, so somebody has parasites in the microbiome, and it's like a freeloader. So we could, and again, this is a stretch, I understand it. So what is one of the things in our humanness that we experience the most, that we have within us all the time, which is virus? So
Mhm.
what if this process, this trauma was like a virus? What if that was a metaphor for it? That what it does is it can lie dormant, and then the right chemistry changes in the body, or the right imbalance that happens, or maybe the imbalance of the neurological psychological part gets triggered. There's your word, triggered. Then what's going to happen is that trauma is going to get triggered. It's going to be like this virus that suddenly has been dormant, that just has a perfect environment for it to be able to come and become active and do its thing.
So the thing is, with a virus, it doesn't have a nucleus. Viruses don't
It
have,
does not.
and so it has to enter a cell in order to capture, overtake, and use the nucleus, so then that virus can replicate.
Absolutely.
So what I'm hearing you say is the trauma lies dormant as a virus, and then it has the right environment. Like it could be the final straw that broke the camel's back,
Yep.
could be just one big blow after a series of small blows. It could be three big blows and no small blows, right? It could be
Correct.
any one of those things. And that often I hear trauma comes about 7 years apart. I've heard that, or something happens and then 7 years later you've got symptoms. I've heard that. And so then it's taking advantage. So how would it take? So then the microbiome would be um, vulnerable, do you think?
Yes, I would say that from a chemical standpoint in the physiology of the body,
Okay.
I would say that. But so the question I have is, yes, it can be chemically influenced, but can it really be destroyed? Can it really be, can we eradicate the trauma? Can we eradicate the parasite? Can we eradicate whatever it is?
No, because I think it's there energetically always, like Kirlian
It
photography.
is. It is.
So I think it's there always. I think it's there in cellular memory.
Yes, it is.
And I think that the body then it goes from story to backstory, is what I
It
think.
does.
Yeah, that's what I think. You can never eradicate a virus fully. Never.
No,
There's
you cannot.
absolutely no evidence of that.
But what you can do is that you can identify it.
Yes.
And by identifying it, as you identify a trauma, so if we were to go in and, stories build on stories, traumas build on traumas, but if you can go and work your way through that trauma, so for example, with that personality is to create the space where it's safe
Mhm.
for them to be able to bring that trauma to the surface, to be able to even see it. I think that's one of the real gifts of Francine Chaparro's work of EMDR, even neurolinguistic programming. We've got a lot of modalities. Bring it to the surface to where it can't hide anymore. Then what we can do is we can see it, we can get to the root of it, we can name it if we need to. And once we do that, then it doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then it doesn't go back in. It can't hide anymore. The trauma cannot hide anymore.
So then if we take that concept and put the trauma in the tissues, breast cancer, for example, has to do with nurturing, not feeling nurtured, nurturing too much.
Right.
And you've got left or right, left side being feminine, more receiving from mother or giving as a mother to others without caring for self. The right side, more, I think, outward to the world and more of a masculine.
Right.
And they literally have found in tumors viruses. Absolutely.
Yes.
They're there. They find in plaques of the heart viruses.
Yep.
And they, and so then we think of this concept of inflammation as, well, always taken to an extreme, the pendulum one way. Inflammation is problematic. By definition, it's how we heal, because it takes whatever's abnormal, creates a reaction within the immune system to bring healing to that area. So a person who has, say, a buildup of plaque in the arteries of the heart, and I know I'm jumping from organ to organ and disease to disease here, so thanks for following me, but we've got the plaque where you've got a virus, maybe some virus, because a lot of people who had COVID all of a sudden developed cardiovascular disease from the inflammation.
Absolutely.
And what we've done collectively is blame the patient for being a less than ideal person, or a bad person, or a patient who never paid attention to themselves before. Meanwhile, we've got this virus that was pretty doggone significant to the world, disrupting people's psychoneuroimmunological system.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you've got a buildup of plaque, and then we're finding that the viruses is just kicking into action the inflammation.
So what if we were to say that trauma is like a virus, that it can be dormant, and then in the repetitive, we'll say 7 years, it becomes active again? Well, there's a series of situations that cause it to become active again. And what if we were to say that the ultimate goal of trauma, kind of like a virus, we're not going to lose the trauma. We're not going to lose the experience. We're not going to lose the thought. But what if we were to do trauma work to where we could create an environment that was hostile, like we do for a virus, to keep it dormant, to create an environment that brings that trauma to the surface, to let it be seen, to be heard, whatever we want to say, and then to create a protocol of trauma work that could give someone the power to create their own inner environment or connection with themselves, or understanding who they are, that old mantra, know thyself process. Then what could happen is they could start in that preventative process, they could start to see the patterns of the coping of the personality and the behavior that lead to that virus, that trauma becoming active again.
Gotcha. Yes. And then in time, because the body heals, could heal up arteries, could change arteries, could
Absolutely
calcify soft plaques, could dissolve soft plaques. Both is totally reasonable.
Exactly. Well, and then if we looked at trauma as plaque and hard and rigid, And we looked at the fact that we are neurologically hardwired a specific way. It is our survival mechanism. And we looked at it instead of trying to become whole brain or try to fit into all of these different perceptions, and just recognize that, yes, we can expand. Yes, we can see things from a broader perspective. Yes, we can interact differently. But the bottom line that I've learned over and over again with my personality work is when stress changes the chemistry in the body, that neurology of those traits of that personality are going to hunker down, and that is who you are. And that is who you're going to be. And that is the way you're going to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to know that and to be aware of how it expresses itself, then we don't go into the self-judgment that creates more emotional attachments to the trauma. Now we're really broken. Now we're really this. Now we're not going to be able to. I think that's what I found with my personality work is this is who you are.
Yes.
This is who you are. This is your survival. So, for example, I'm going to use, if I may, I'll do me, but because if you're comfortable with it, it's the same personalities.
That's
Are you
fine.
comfortable if I do that? Okay. So with our personality is one that is neurologically hardwired to basically dance around between the two frontal lobes and the two temporal lobes. And everything that we interact with starts out as a concept. It's a perception. And once that perception starts to gel, or that concept gels in our mind, we go from that left temporal lobe that is really quite rigid. That's the logic, rational, analytical part of who we are. We start there, and now we need to somehow understand. So we cross over to that right frontal lobe, which is kind of, Jung called it the intuitive lobe, meaning the perceptional, the expanded perception, the intuitive, empathic were words that he used. So what that does is it triggers in the visual qualities of our 5 physical senses. So we have this concept, and now what we want to do is we want to see tangibly, is that a valid concept? We read books, we watch YouTubes, we do anything that will basically present to us what we conceptually know. If we can't find what's black and white and tangible to support the concept, we back up into that left temporal lobe and we go, is the concept flawed?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which then
I'm familiar
expands it.
with this.
Yes, so am I. So what happens is now it's expanded the concept. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's not good. It's just expanded it. Go back to that right frontal lobe. We get this image. Bing, we start seeing things that, yes, this is a real potential concept that here's information for it. Then we cross over into that left frontal lobe, and now we use words. Now we start talking. We ask questions. And our personality is one that we're just like the little kid that's 2 years old that never stops asking questions. Why is the water blue? Why is the sky this? Why is that? And everything. Curious, curious. People think we're interrogating them.
Right.
All we're doing is trying to hear whether their concept is being, we speak it, how are they reacting, verbal, nonverbal? If they react the way that it matches the concept, we go back over to that right frontal lobe. We go back to that left temporal lobe. Okay, now the stars are aligning.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go over into that right limbic temporal lobe. And it's like we put our toe in the water to emotionally see, does this feel right? Does the concept feel valid? Does it feel sound? Am I going to be safe in being able to present it? What kind of challenges am I going to get? What kind of obstacles? What kind of criticisms I'm going to get? We go back in, put that toe in the water. And if there's trauma in our childhood that somewhere in our personality made us feel stupid or incompetent, that trauma stops the process. Now we're in analysis paralysis. Mm-hmm. What does that do to our body? It changes the chemistry instantly. It creates the interaction between the brain, the nervous system, and the physical body completely differently. And now what we do is that it feels so uncomfortable. And that trauma, we don't even know what that trauma is because it's built on itself. We just know that it bit our toe and we're not going to go there. It's not that we're avoiding, we're just in our rationalization, we're just not quite ready. That's our rationalization. Then what happens is then we start getting to the point where we protect that trauma, and then we become very secretive of our emotions. We become very avoidant of relationships that are emotionally complex because that may open up that trauma. That may make us feel like we're stupid, or make us feel like we're inadequate, or we're not competent, or we don't have enough, blah, 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 blah. See how this builds up on it. So if we recognized in the understanding of personality, this is what your brain does. It zigzags. It's designed to do that. It's going to always do that. Mm-hmm. When you get pressed to having to make a decision before you've had a time for that to zigzag, it's going to feed the trauma that was somehow implanted when you were a child. Mm-hmm. And every time you put that toe in that water, it's going to be that trauma that's going to bite you.
Well, you know, between age 1 and 7, they talk about a lot of our thoughts are really put into us because we're in a theta state very often during that age.
We are.
And what they're finding is a lot of our, I don't know if I would call them personality traits, but decision-making defaults, maybe our defaults.
Yep, that's coping.
Yep, would come from the trauma or the statements that were told to us.
Exactly.
Well, you're never going to get this right. Well, you stupid kid. Well, you know, all those things literally go into the subconscious. And then if we live 97% out of our subconscious and 3% from our conscious area, we're really going to be reacting or coping primarily from the subconscious then, aren't we?
Absolutely, we are. And the subconscious is emotional.
Yeah.
It's that kind of sacred vault or
right.
secret vault of the emotions that we have felt that hurt.
Yes. And so then what if our thoughts define our health?
Correct.
Our thoughts impact our illness, which we talked about illness being different than disease, illness being the whole integral approach to our beingness, our health and beingness, and disease being a hierarchical, structured context for us to understand illness. Mm-hmm. Really, we've got to go back and clear the subconscious. We've got to go back and identify clearly our personality traits, because we might pick on our personality as something that, while it's hardwired and it's technically neutral, but it's just us, where we might be trying to hit our head against the wall, no pun intended, of something that is just there by personality.
Absolutely. And it's our survival.
Yeah.
And it's our survival. So rather than, you know, in our case with our personality, rather than criticizing ourselves for maybe taking too long to make a decision because we have to really think about it.
Yeah.
Maybe what we do is we recognize that we need to be able to say in situations, I can't give you an answer right now because I need to think about it. But if we were raised in a family, or one member of our family was a different personality, which is the way that it works, and they say, well, thinking about it isn't going to be the solution, and I want you to do something right now, and we're afraid of any kind of emotional or physical reaction, what are we going to do? We are going to negate that part of who we are, and that feeds the trauma because it feeds the rigidity, versus just being able to, and we don't have the psychological bandwidth to do this at these impressionable ages when we're children.
Yep. And we literally become a hazard to ourselves without.
Absolutely, we do.
Without trying to.
We basically reject ourselves.
Yeah. We
basically reject the part of us that is a very survival part.
Which is the root of autoimmunity.
Absolutely it is, because we're odds with ourselves.
Yeah.
We are literally fighting ourselves rather than know thyself. And, you know, maybe it doesn't fit in the family. Maybe it doesn't fit in your relationship because the other person's a different personality. Opposites do attract. But if you know who you are and you know that when anything is perceived by the mind first as a physical or psychological threat, you are going to go to that hardwiring and you are going to be rigid. And you either compromise that and bury it, or you speak it and you pay the consequences.
The hard wiring, we come in with that. Do you think we come in, does that come in through the DNA? Does that come in from our soul? Does that come in from both?
I think it comes in from both. I tried, because like you, I like to read and I like to research.
Yeah.
I've tried so many different ways to be able to answer that question from a soul's perspective. And scientifically, I can't jump through the hoops enough to make it happen.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that I do know from what I learned in my near-death experiences is that the neurology that we choose to be able to gather information and make decisions, which is our survival mechanism, is basically chosen because it will be the most effective way for us to do our soul work and live our purpose.
Gotcha.
I also believe, whether it's a chicken and egg or catch-22 or whatever term we want to use, I believe that that neurological imprinting, hardwiring of that is also part of our DNA.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I would say so.
And if we just even would be open to the fact that, so for example, a person who makes a decision that if it feels that needs to feel right, to be able to be comfortable enough to say that doesn't feel right and not duck because they're afraid everything's going to be thrown at them.
Right.
Through this work of trauma, it's become very logically approached.
Okay. Are you saying, I'm going to bite there. Are you saying that that's a good thing or not a good thing?
I think it was a good thing, but I think now with where we're recognizing that any experience that in any way creates a power struggle within or a compromise within is that it's going to create and feed and trauma. I think that we need to look at it differently.
I agree with you. I'm in full agreement with that.
Yep.
When I do, so the protocol I use is self-care and connection, which it's built on the shoulders of advanced integrative therapy by Dr. Asha Clinton, who is a social worker as well as a PhD. And hers is built on Jungian concepts as well, and archetypes and things like that. And that was great. And that was super deep and lovely and logical. And it was really rich and full and helped me categorize, put things in hierarchies and all that. And I didn't have time for it because it was so extensive. As a physician, I had to move through things quickly, right? I had to come to decisions quickly, 15, 30 minutes, that type of thing, right? And folks were often in crisis. And then, learning and watching the movie, The Wisdom of Trauma that Gabor Mate did, and listening to that and understanding that all trauma causes us to disconnect and we need to reconnect and we're hardwired for connection to ourselves and others. What I did was I just shortened the steps.
Yep.
And I made this, what I call like an umbrella statement of even though ... whatever it is, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. I choose to connect and reconnect with myself. And we go through that 3 times. It takes about 90 seconds. That sets the vagal tone. It changes from
yes, it does
relaxation. Then I say, okay, and we know what we've got. We're working with a construct, we're working with a topic, we're working with a situation. And so then we begin to just take what comes to the surface. And in this process, and this isn't linear, I thought it would be linear because I would go maybe by age, and developmental process, and the hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy, and the whole kit and caboodle. And all of a sudden it began to not be linear.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just followed it. And as an osteopath, I learned to follow that when we learned to unwind myofascia, right?
Correct.
And so just follow what the body wanted to do. So I followed what the soul wanted to do. And in doing that, intuitively, what I found is people brought up different events that they never thought were connected.
Correct.
And I would just scribble the notes, and then we would treat them, and we would use the energy vortices, which are the chakras. And then what happened was literally memories were recovered,
Mm-hmm.
and literally events all of a sudden made sense that never made sense before. And so then when we presented it to the nervous system, the trauma of going through what happened just began to literally dissipate,
Correct.
because we presented to the nervous system a way for it to process, and a way for it to go on a subjective scale of 1 to 10, from a 10 down to a 1 to 0.
You gave their neurology, their traits of their personality, the space for it to do
Yes.
what it's designed to do in a non-threatening, hostile way.
Yes. Yes. And I can tell you how this has changed people's lives.
Absolutely.
And I'm talking folks who have been shouldered with chronic illness that in the functional medicine world, in the integrative world, there's no answers for. Chronic Lyme disease
Correct.
always has trauma, always has massive trauma.
Absolutely.
Massive trauma. And it's latent, just like the Lyme is latent. It's just as latent. And then how certain patterns of sexual abuse would come to the surface.
Correct.
And it was just time and time again. And I honestly was just amazed, and still, and I'm very, I'm humbled and amazed to see how the nervous system is able to pick up these symptoms, these cues, these vitals that we give to it, and process it. It's just been amazing.
Yeah.
And then underneath their personality emerges.
Their true personality, not the coping. I mean, the coping is it's like what we put on in the morning to be able to fit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not bad.
Yeah,
that's exactly.
Yeah, we could call it cultural indoctrination, or
correct.
Up the Mount Delectable, if we're looking at the Divine Comedy,
Yep.
that type of thing.
Exactly. But if we understand that true neurology part of who we are, that is what runs the brain. That's what affects the nervous system. That's what affects the organs, the glands, the everything. And I know and I understand that this is my world and I'm very passionate about it. But just knowing how we gather and make decisions gives us the power to change our traumas, to truly create sustainable change.
Yes.
Not just the wannabe change, not the part that we just say, okay, I'm going to change, and then we do it for 5 days, kind of like New Year's resolutions. We're going to give it a heck of a try and it lasts for 3 days. But
right.
Truly sustainable change, because what we do is we honor the very mechanism that's part of our survival.
That's right. Yeah, and the the idea of being a hazard to yourself just literally goes away.
It does. Well, and it gives you, it takes away even the motivation to have to defend yourself or to look over your shoulder. It's just like, even with that, one of the things I found with all the years I've been doing this is that if you understand who you are neurologically, because that affects the words that you use, this way you put sentences together. So for example, a logical decision maker is going to ask what questions, an emotion decision maker is going to ask why questions. Well, if you're in an environment where you're getting a why question, you're logical, you're going to get defensive. If you're an emotion decision maker and somebody's throwing logic at you, you're going to get defensive. And what does that do? That creates power struggle, i.e. stress. So if you find yourself in those situations, then it'd be like taking a deep breath. And it's not like, well, this is who I am and they are that. It's just like, oh, they see things differently than I do.
Right. And it seems, and I have to, press this question a little bit. It seems like your personality test that you've developed after, years of research and putting this together is different than other personality tests that I've taken.
It is because, and again, this goes back. So one of the things that really attracted me with Jung's work versus so many others that I read and was taught in psychology classes and everything, is that Jung always, in his work of archetypes, always honored the sacred.
Yes.
Always honored the spiritual. And in this process, when I came back from my near-death experience, I realized, kind of like that cliche, is that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And sometimes it's really with ease and other times it's not. So what I did is I started working and doing research, actually with Stanford, and doing some brain scanning, and would throw words that would appeal to a emotion decision maker, and literally could watch that part of their brain light up, see an actual chemical difference. And so what I did is I started realizing the power of words. And while we can say, like we're doing almost an hour of these podcasts, that we could take one single sentence and we could choose one word that would relate to that person's neurology, that would engage them. And now we have communication. Now we've got true interaction void of conflict. Or we could use a word that was creating conflict in us that would therefore energetically create conflict in them. So I really went in, and the words, there's a word embedded in every statement that basically talks to one part of the brain. And there are three statements that are called transition statements. It's like one part says to the brain, who am I? And then we want to go to another part of the brain, and then it's a transition statement. And that transition statement creates like chaos. It's like, I don't know who I am. And then it sets the stage for the next statements and those next words for that part of the brain to identify itself. So it's like, it knows itself, it doesn't, it knows itself. In trauma, we know ourself without trauma. We have trauma, and then we try to find ourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It means we're not connecting, is what I'm hearing.
We're not connecting.
Right.
We're not connecting. So if we really looked at trauma from a bigger, higher perspective, I'm going to say it that way because that's the word that came through, is that it literally is a self-compromise. And we could find tools to bring those traumas forward, to find out what the trigger or the word or the emotion is that causes that trauma. Mm-hmm. The memory of it stays, but the emotion is gone and the body goes back to healing. Mm-hmm. We don't hold it in our muscles.
Yep. Yes. Yes. I'm pausing now. We'll call this a pause cast. I'm just
Well, that's part of our personality. We have to go in and we have to be able to just kind of connect the dots and see where they fit in and
Yeah.
then take it from there. So that's all, that's what that is.
And so that's, I have to say, that's why I wanted to have your color personality test available to all my patients. We're in
Mhm.
the process of putting it on the wellness, the care and wellness community, which everybody needs to go and check it out through drmarylauder.com. There's your commercial for today. Click on to join the community, but we're going to add the personality test there because I want everybody who is dealing with trauma, which is us all, right? We all know that now.
Exactly. We all have it.
If you haven't gotten that from the podcast, please get that from the podcast. It be all of us, folks. We be in this together.
So laughingly, lovingly said, yes, you are traumatized just like all the rest of us. However,
Exactly.
it's an illusion.
Exactly. Exactly. So my goal is to have people understand the beauty of who they are. So when we're going
Correct.
through the healing part, when we're going through the part that feels like a bit walking in wet cement,
Mhm.
and so that was one of the questions I had. Probably our final question as we, wind things down here is, have you ever seen someone's color change, their personality color change because of trauma being healed? Or
No,
did you just kind of, okay, good.
nope,
That tells
nope,
me it's hard wiring right there.
yep,
Yeah.
nope, it doesn't. The coping may change, but the hard wiring does not.
Yeah. All right. Well, there, ladies and gentlemen, is church. I'll say a big amen to that one.
And that's all there is, folks.
Exactly. Oh, we don't even have to pass a collection plate on that one. Just the good news is that the healing that can occur energetically, holistically, integrally, where we're, really putting the pieces together, can come into alignment with truly who our personality is and who
Correct.
we are. And by and large, I have never seen an ugly personality. I just have not seen that. Just like I've never seen an ugly person. Never. Haven't seen it. Don't look at them that way.
Correct.
Leave us that way. And so I would say that this could be a just huge message of hope and a huge message of encouragement. Hope means you've got a feeling of something that you can attain, and you've got a way to get there. That's the definition of hope. It's not empty. It's how you want to go somewhere and you got a plan. That's hope. And I see these steps in terms of doing self-care and connection, or folks do other things like emotional freedom technique, EMDR,
Correct.
tapping, etc. Whatever you choose to do as a modality, and understanding who you are in a personality standpoint, really bringing that wholeness to the healing for who you are.
Absolutely. And it's a preventative measure. It's a very powerful preventative measure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I don't
that's
know who we're going to prevent yet, because everybody's dealing with it right now, to be honest. So when you
well,
say preventive, be preventive so we don't get diseases, or because everybody's traumatized?
well, preventative from the standpoint that you recognize that everybody's traumatized and that you recognize maybe have just even a little bit of information as to just simplistically said that trauma is any time that we compromise who we are, disassociate, disconnect.
Gotcha. Yep.
And if you are aware of that and you just even plant that seed in your psychological coffers, then when you find yourself in situations that struggle or that conflict starts to nip you in the backside or smack you in the face, then you can take a deep breath and you can do something as simple as saying, they just see it differently than I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean you're right. It's just different.
Yeah.
And that's the gift of those different perceptions.
It is.
So that's a preventative part.
And a way to say it a little more colorful is not my monkey circus, not my
Exactly.
turtle, my turtle house.
Exactly. And again, what it does, it just, most importantly, it keeps you hormonally, physiologically, energetically connected.
Yes. It all,
And that,
yes.
for me, that is the true essence of healing.
Yes. And somewhere in there, and I don't know the exact pathway, but it's going to touch on that part of the brain that then brings the inner peace.
And that part of the brain is actually connected energetically, neurologically through the nervous system to the human heart.
And that's on the base, the bottom outside of the hippocampus.
It is, exactly.
Yes. Woo, goosebumps. Goosebumps. Holy Ghost. Holy Ghost goosebumps there. Exactly.
The ancient metaphysicians referred that to the doorway to thyself.
Yes. I believe it. I believe it. Wow. Okay. Well, another episode in the books here. Another one for the ages. Carol, it is absolutely delightful to have you be a host with me and to explore all these topics. It's just fantastic.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. It's a very rare opportunity to be able to do this. And thank you all of the listeners from the standpoint of cosmically dancing with us in all of these potentialities.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for everybody. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be fun. We're going to just keep on going. We'll find more topics to explore. So thank you everybody for listening in on Cosmic Health and Wellness, a variation on the theme of Since You Put It That Way. And our host, Dr. Carol Ritberger and Dr. Mary Lauder. We look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, be well. Thank you for joining us on the Since You Put It That Way podcast. Today's episode was written and produced by Crowded Table Productions. Technical editing, Malin Long Lopes. Sound editing, Jonathan Fiegel. Music, The River Jordan, written and performed by May Erlewine. Please rate and review our podcast as well. We appreciate your feedback, and hey, be positive, share the love.